Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the exploration ship Horizon and watched the blue planet grow larger on the main screen. His crew had been traveling for 6 months to reach this star system, and now they were finally here. The ships. Computers had picked up radio signals from the fourth planet weeks ago, and everyone was excited about meeting new aliens. Lisa Webb sat at her communication station with headphones on. She had been trying to understand the alien language for days. Now, the sounds were strange and musical like birds singing, but there were patterns that made sense. Her translation computer was slowly learning how to change their words into human words. Amy Foster walked onto the bridge carrying a tablet, full of data about the planet below. She was the ship's expert on alien life and had spent years studying creatures from other worlds. The planet looked perfect for life with blue oceans and green continents, but something felt different about this place. Ben Clark was piloting the ship closer to the planet. When his sensors started beeping, there were cities down there, but they were built in strange places. All the buildings were high up on mountains or floating on lakes. None of the cities were built on flat ground near the forest like human cities would be. The alien ship that came to meet them was beautiful and delicate, looking like it was made of glass and silver. It moved in smooth curves instead of straight lines and seemed almost afraid to come too close to the human ship. When the aliens finally agreed to come aboard the Horizon, Jake could see why their ship looked so fragile. The Zephyrians were tall and thin with skin you could almost see through. They had 4 arms that moved like dancers and eyes that were too big for their faces. Their leader called himself Vexkala and spoke through Lisa's translation machine with a voice that sounded like wind chimes. Vexkala seemed happy to meet humans, but also nervous about something. He answered questions about his people and their culture, but whenever Amy asked about the forests on his planet, he would change the subject. The Zephyrians lived in floating cities and mountain towns, but never on the ground level. When Don Rogers asked to see pictures of their world, Vexkala showed them beautiful images of crystal cities floating above lakes and towns carved into cliff faces. Every picture showed Zephyrians living high above the ground. Don noticed that all the forest areas in the pictures were empty of any buildings or people. Amy became more curious about this and asked directly why nobody lived in the forests. Vexkala's 4 arms moved in what looked like fear, and the translation machine struggled with his words. Finally, it said something like "Forbidden's hunting grounds of the Deathbringer," but that did not make much sense to the humans. Jake thought. Maybe it was a religious thing, or perhaps the forests were protected nature areas. Many human worlds had places where people were not allowed to build cities. But the way Vexkala talked about it seemed different. It was not respect or rules that kept his people away from the forests. It was fear. Lisa tried asking different questions about the ground-level areas, but every time she did, all the Zephyrians would become quiet and nervous. Their 4 arms would move in strange patterns, and they would look at each other with their big eyes. Something down in those forests scared them very badly. Ben was running his regular scans of the planet when something caught his attention on the sensors. There was movement in the forest canopy, but it was too big to be birds or small animals. He switched to visual cameras and tried to get a better look at whatever was moving down there. What he saw made him call everyone to look at his screen. Something huge was moving through the trees with smooth and deadly grace. It was easily as big as a whale, but it moved like a hunting cat. The creature seemed to flow through the forest canopy without making the branches shake very much. When Ben showed the footage to Vexkala and the other Zephyrians, their reaction was immediate and terrifying. All their graceful movements stopped and they froze like statues. Their big eyes got even bigger and their skin changed color to a pale white. One of them made a sound like a bird screaming. Vexkala started talking very fast in his own language, and the translation machine could not keep up. Lisa worked frantically to adjust the settings while the Zephyrians seemed to panic. Finally, the machine started working again, and Vexkala's words came through clearly. "You must leave this place." "Immediately," he said. "The Voar Cathan is awake and moving. Your ship is not safe here. Nothing is safe when the world ender hunts. We must return to the high places before it senses us. Jake looked at his crew and then back at the frightened aliens. Whatever was in those forests had an entire civilization living in terror. The Zephyrians had advanced technology and beautiful cities, but they were hiding from something in their own world's forests. Something they called the World Ender. Vexcala sat in the meeting room with his hands shaking as he tried to explain the terror that ruled his world. The translation machine worked better now, and Lisa could understand most of what he said. The story he told made the human crew sit in shocked silence. For 3,000 years, the Voarcathan had been the masters of the Zephyrian homeworld. These creatures were not just big predators, but something far worse. They were smart enough to plan and patient enough to wait. They could climb any wall, swim across any lake, and think their way through any defense the Zephyrians built. Dan Rogers asked for more details about these creatures, and what Vexcala told him sounded like something from a nightmare. The Voarcathan were 12 feet tall with thick armor covering their bodies. They had multiple rows of teeth like sharks and long tentacle arms that could grab things and use simple tools. Worst of all, they were smart enough to learn. Amy Foster listened carefully as Vexcala described how the creatures hunted. They would watch Zephyrian settlements for days or weeks, learning the patterns of daily life. Then they would strike at the perfect moment when defenses were weakest. They could work together in groups or hunt alone depending on what worked best. The Zephyrians had tried everything to fight back over the centuries, but nothing worked. Their energy weapons barely scratched the creature's armor. Their walls and barriers were climbed over or knocked down. Even their floating cities were not completely safe because the Voarcathan could swim and had learned to build simple rafts. Ben Clark asked why they did not just leave the planet and find a new world to live on. Vexcala explained that they had tried that too. The few ships that managed to escape and find other worlds had discovered that Voarcathan eggs were hidden in their ships. The creatures spread to every world the Zephyrians tried to colonize. Lisa noticed something strange about the Zephyrian language as she worked with the translation programs. Their words had dozens of different terms for hiding, running away, and being afraid, but they seemed to have no words at all for fighting back or hunting other creatures. It was like the concept of being a predator was completely foreign to. Then Jake asked about their military and what weapons they had for protection. This question seemed to confuse Vexcala greatly. He showed them what the Zephyrians called weapons, but they were really just noisemakers and bright lights designed to scare the Voarcathan away for a short time. The idea of actually hurting or killing the creatures seemed impossible to them. Dan studied the historical records that Vexcala shared with them. 800 years ago, the Zephyrians had made their last serious attempt to fight the Voarcathan. They had built armies and tried to clear the creatures from one small continent. The war lasted only 6 months before the Voarcathan won completely. After that defeat, the creatures had systematically destroyed every ground-level settlement on the planet. They seemed to understand that the Zephyrians had tried to fight back, and they made sure it would never happen again. Millions of Zephyrians died, and the survivors were forced to live only in the high mountains and floating cities. Amy was fascinated by the biological data about the Voarcathan. They seemed to be perfect evolutionary predators that had developed specifically to hunt intelligent prey. Their armor protected them from most weapons. Their intelligence let them solve complex problems, and their physical strength made them nearly unstoppable. The most terrifying thing about the creatures was how they seemed to enjoy the hunt. Vexcala told stories of Voarcathan that would capture Zephyrians alive and keep them for days before killing them. They appeared to take pleasure in causing fear and suffering. Jake asked if the creatures ever fought each other or had any natural enemies. Vexcala said that young Voarcathan sometimes fought over territory, but the adult creatures seemed to have no natural predators at all. They were at the very top of their world's food chain and had been there for millions of years. The human crew began to understand why the Zephyrians lived the way they did. Their entire civilization was built around hiding from and avoiding these apex predators. Their technology focused on concealment and escape rather than exploration or expansion. They were prisoners on their own world, Lisa asked about the creature that Ben had filmed in the forest. Vexcala said it was probably a young adult male hunting alone. The females were even larger and more dangerous, especially when they had eggs to protect. The biggest males could grow to 20 feet long and were strong enough to knock down buildings. When Amy asked how many Vil-Ar-Cathan lived on the planet, Vexcala could only guess. His people avoided the ground level so completely that they had no accurate count. There might be hundreds or thousands of the creatures living in the vast forests below the floating cities. The meeting ended with Vexcala begging the humans to leave the system immediately. He was terrified that their presence might anger the Vil-Ar-Cathan and cause them to attack the Zephyrian cities. In his mind, the creatures were like forces of nature that could not be fought or reasoned with. As the Zephyrians returned to their ship, the human crew sat around the table with very different thoughts. Jake looked at his people and saw something in their eyes that Vexcala would not have understood. Where the Zephyrians saw an impossible enemy, the humans saw an interesting challenge. Amy was already making plans to study one of these creatures. Up close, Dan was thinking about what kind of weapons might work against their armor. Ben wanted to track their movements and learn their hunting patterns. Even Lisa was curious about how intelligent they really were. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Vil-Ar-Cathan were about to meet something they had never encountered before. They were about to meet a species that did not see them as unstoppable apex predators. They were about to meet humans. Amy Foster stood in the lab looking at the scan data from the planet below. The Vil-Ar-Cathan creatures fascinated her from a scientific viewpoint, and she wanted to study one up close. She had examined predators from dozens of worlds, but never anything quite like this. The combination of size, intelligence, and armor made them unique. Joe Martinez was in the ship's kitchen looking at the same scan data, but thinking about very different things. As the ship's food specialist, he noticed that the creatures appeared to have excellent muscle development and lived in what looked like perfect free-range conditions. The scans showed they were pure carnivores with meat that would probably taste quite good. Amy went to Captain Morrison with a formal request to conduct a field study of the Vil-Ar-Cathan. She argued that understanding the local ecosystem was important for any future human settlements in the system. Jake listened to her proposal, but was concerned about the safety of his crew. Kate Sullivan supported Amy's request from an engineering perspective. She pointed out that the ship's scanners could only tell them so much about the creatures from orbit. If humans were going to establish any kind of presence in this system, they needed to understand what they were dealing with. The Zephyrians were horrified when they learned about the human plan. Vexcala came back to the ship with several other council members to beg the humans not to go down to the surface. They brought historical records of the last time anyone had tried to study the Vil-Ar-Cathan up close, 500 years ago. A group of young Zephyrian scientists had attempted to observe the creatures from hidden shelters in the forest. The Vil-Ar-Cathan had found every hiding place within days and killed all the researchers. Since then, no Zephyrian had set foot in the forests and survived. Rick Palmer listened to these stories but was more interested in the tactical information they contained. As the ship's security chief, he noted that the Zephyrian weapons were basically sophisticated versions of flashlights and noisemakers. They had never tried using actual weapons against the creatures. Amy assembled her research team carefully. She chose Joe Martinez because his practical skills might be useful in the field. Rick assigned two of his best security officers, Linda Hayes and Steve Cooper, to protect the science team. Both officers had experience hunting dangerous animals. On other worlds, Joe quietly began researching cooking methods for large game animals. He had noticed that the Vil-Ar-Cathan scans showed meat distribution similar to earth buffalo or elk. His computer searches included topics like field dressing techniques and proper smoking methods for tough meat. The Zephyrians tried everything they could think of to stop the humans from going to the surface. They offered to share their most advanced technologies, promised to give the humans valuable trade agreements, and even suggested other star systems where humans could settle safely. Vexkala brought recordings of Voarkathan vocalizations to demonstrate how terrifying the creatures sounded. The recordings were indeed impressive, with deep roaring sounds and sharp clicking noises. But to the humans they sounded like the calls of any large predator rather than something supernatural. Linda Hayes spent time studying the Zephryan footage of Voarkathan attacks. She noticed that the creatures relied mainly on size, strength, and intimidation. Their attack patterns were direct and brutal, but not particularly sophisticated. They seemed to expect their prey to run away rather than fight back. Steve Krupper was more interested in the creature's armor plating. The Zephryan scans showed thick hide with bony plates covering vital areas. It looked impressive, but Steve had dealt with armored predators before. The right weapons with enough power could penetrate almost any natural armor. Amy's official mission plan focused on observing Voarkathan behavior from a safe distance and collecting biological samples. The real plan that she discussed privately with her team was more ambitious. They wanted to capture or kill one of the creatures for detailed study. Jake finally approved the mission after adding several safety requirements. The team would carry emergency beacons that could summon immediate pickup from the ship. They would stay in constant communication with the bridge, and they would abort the mission at the first sign of serious danger. The Zephyrians watched in stunned silence as the human shuttle launched toward their homeworld. Vexkala muttered prayers in his own language while his council members discussed whether they should flee the system before the Voarkathan retaliated against everyone in the area. Amy's team landed in a forest clearing about 50 miles from the nearest Zephryan settlement. The trees were enormous and ancient, creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground. The air was humid and filled with the sounds of smaller creatures moving through the undergrowth. Joe immediately began setting up what he called a field kitchen near their landing site. The other team members thought he was just preparing emergency rations, but Joe was actually getting ready to process whatever they managed to hunt. He had brought spices and cooking equipment that seemed excessive for a research mission. Linda and Steve established a defensive perimeter around their camp while Amy set up her scientific instruments. The forest felt alive with unseen watchers, but nothing showed itself during their first few hours on the ground. The team began to wonder if the Zephyrians had exaggerated the danger. Then the forest went completely silent, and Amy's motion detectors started showing large movements in the trees around them. Something big was circling their camp and studying them, just like Vexkala had warned. The Voarkathan had found them through her binoculars. Amy caught her first clear glimpse of one of the creatures as it moved between the massive tree trunks. It was every bit as large and impressive as the Zephryan descriptions had claimed. But to Amy it looked like a very big, very dangerous animal rather than the unstoppable force of nature that terrorized an entire civilization. The creature seemed to be waiting for them, to run away like every other intelligent species it had ever encountered. When the humans stayed in place and continued their work, the Voarkathan appeared confused by this behavior. It had probably never met prey that did not immediately try to escape. Joe Martinez looked at the creature through his own binoculars and made careful notes about its size and build. In his notebook he wrote estimated cooking times and temperature requirements. As far as Joe was concerned, they had just found the main course for the biggest barbecue in human history. The Voarkathan emerged from the forest shadows like something from the Zephyrians' worst nightmares. It stood 12 feet tall with thick armored plates covering its body and tentacle-like arms that moved with deadly grace. Multiple rows of sharp teeth gleamed in its massive jaw as it studied the small group of humans who had dared to enter its domain. Amy Foster watched through her scanner as the creature approached their camp. Every measurement confirmed what the Zephyrians had told them about these apex predators. The Voarkathan was perfectly designed for hunting intelligent prey with armor that could deflect most weapons and intelligence that rivaled the great apes of Earth. Linda Hayes raised her plasma rifle and checked the power settings. The weapon was standard issue for human security forces and designed to stop the largest predators found on most worlds. She had used similar weapons to hunt creatures almost as big as the Va-Arcathan, but never anything quite this heavily armored. The creature stopped about 50 yards from their camp and made a series of clicking and roaring sounds. Its behavior seemed designed to terrify prey into running away. The Va-Arcathan had probably used the same intimidation tactics successfully for millions of years. Against every species it encountered, Steve Cooper moved to get a better angle for his shot while the creature was distracted by its threat display. He had studied the scan data and identified what looked like weak points in the armor plating around the neck and joint areas. The plasma rifle should be able to penetrate those spots if he aimed carefully. Amy activated her recording equipment to document their first close encounter with a living Va-Arcathan. The creature was magnificent in its own terrifying way, and she wanted to capture every detail of its anatomy and behavior. This was the kind of discovery that could make a scientist's entire career. Joe Martinez watched the creature through binoculars while mentally calculating cooking times for something that size. The Va-Arcathan looked like it would provide enough meat to feed a small army. He was particularly interested in the large muscle groups along the creature's back and legs. The Va-Arcathan seemed confused when the humans did not immediately flee. In terror, it moved closer to their camp and made louder threatening noises. This had always worked before against every intelligent species the creature had ever encountered. Prey was supposed to run away when faced with an apex predator. Linda took aim at the center of the creature's chest where the armor plating looked thinnest. She had been hunting dangerous animals since she was a teenager, and this felt like just another big game hunt. The Va-Arcathan was impressive, but it was still just an animal that could be killed with the right weapons. The creature charged toward their camp with surprising speed for something so large. Its tentacle arms reached forward to grab the small humans who had invaded its territory. For 3,000 years, this attack had meant certain death for any Zephyrian unlucky enough to face a Va-Arcathan in open ground. Linda's plasma rifle fired with a bright flash and a crackling sound. The energy beam struck the Va-Arcathan directly in the chest and punched through its armor plating like it was made of paper. The creature stumbled, looked down at the smoking hole in its chest with what might have been surprise, and then collapsed onto the forest floor. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Even the small forest creatures seemed stunned by what had just happened. For the first time in millions of years, a Va-Arcathan had been killed by its intended prey instead of the other way around. Amy ran toward the fallen creature with her scanners and sampling equipment. The Va-Arcathan was definitely dead, and she wanted to gather as much data as possible before it started to decompose. This was the first time anyone had been able to study one of these creatures up close. On the ship high above them, the Zephyrians monitoring the human team had gone completely silent. Vexcala stared at his screens in disbelief while his council members made shocked sounds in their musical language. The translation computers could not keep up with their rapid speech. When communication was finally restored, Vexcala's words came through the translator with obvious confusion and fear. "This is not possible," he said. "The world ender cannot die. This breaks the natural order of things. There will be consequences beyond imagination." Amy's detailed examination of the dead Va-Arcathan revealed that while the creature was indeed an apex predator on its world, its armor was primarily evolved to defend against claws, teeth, and simple weapons. The plasma rifle had cut through the plating easily because the creature had never evolved defenses. Against directed energy weapons, the Va-Arcathan's intelligence was impressive for a non-sapient species, but roughly equivalent to Earth's smartest animals. It could use simple tools and plan basic hunting strategies, but it was not the near-magical super-predator that the Zephyrians believed it to be. Joe Martinez approached the specimen with a very different kind of scientific interest. He took samples of the muscle tissue and fat deposits while making notes about marbling and texture. His preliminary assessment was that Va-Arcathan meat would be similar to venison, but with better flavor due to the creature's pure carnivore diet. Steve and Linda set up a perimeter around Amy and Joe while they worked on the creature. The forest had come alive again with small sounds, but there were no signs of other Vaarkathan in the immediate area. The dead predator's scent might actually keep other creatures away for a while. Amy's samples revealed that Vaarkathan biology was fascinating but not supernatural. They were carbon-based life forms with standard predator adaptations taken to an extreme level. Their armor was thick keratin similar to rhino horn. Their tentacle arms were modified limbs with enhanced dexterity. Joe completed his field processing of several hundred pounds of prime Vaarkathan meat while Amy finished her scientific sampling. He was careful to take cuts from different muscle groups to test for variations in taste and texture. His professional opinion was that they had just harvested enough protein to feed the entire crew for weeks. When the team reported back to the ship with their findings, Captain Morrison faced an unprecedented situation. His crew had accidentally solved a 3,000-year-old problem by treating the Zephyrian's unstoppable apex predator as a routine hunting target. The cultural implications were staggering. An entire civilization had been living in terror of creatures that humans could apparently kill with standard equipment. The Zephyrian's whole way of life was based on hiding from predators that were no more dangerous than the large game animals humans hunted for sport. Amy uploaded her biological data while Joe submitted his request for permission to prepare Vaarkathan steaks for the crew. Both reports contained the same basic conclusion. The most feared predator in Zephyrian history was just another big animal that happened to taste good when properly cooked. Captain Morrison stood in his ready room looking at two very different reports about the same dead creature. Amy's scientific analysis described the Vaarkathan as a fascinating but ultimately normal apex predator. Joe's culinary assessment recommended cooking temperatures and seasoning suggestions for what he was calling premium alien venison. The Zephyrians were in a state of complete cultural shock. Vexkala kept repeating that the humans had broken the world and that there would be terrible consequences for killing a world-ender. His people had lived in terror of these creatures for so long that the idea of one being dead seemed impossible to accept. Lisa worked frantically with the translation programs as more Zephyrians called in from their floating cities. The reports of a dead Vaarkathan were spreading through their civilization like wildfire. Some Zephyrians thought it was a lie, while others believed it meant the end of their world. Joe Martinez submitted a formal request to prepare a ship-wide meal using the Vaarkathan meat they had harvested. He pointed out that the crew had been eating recycled protein for months and fresh meat would be good for morale. He also noted that letting several hundred pounds of premium protein go to waste would be criminally wasteful. Amy supported Joe's request for practical reasons. She wanted to document human reactions to consuming an apex predator from another world. The data could be valuable for future first contact situations where humans might need to integrate with local food chains. Kate Sullivan had an idea that might help the Zephyrians understand what had really happened. She worked with Lisa to create a presentation showing humanity's relationship with apex predators throughout their evolutionary history. The goal was to help the aliens realize that humans were predators themselves. The presentation included footage of humans hunting everything from tigers and bears to sharks and whales. Historical data showed how human expansion across Earth had driven most large predators to near extinction through overhunting. Cave paintings depicted early humans successfully hunting mammoths and cave bears. When they showed this presentation to Vexkala and his council, the Zephyrians watched in growing amazement. They had assumed that humans were a peaceful species, like themselves, because they seemed so small and soft. The idea that these friendly aliens were actually apex predators was difficult to process. The translation computer struggled with Zephyrian concepts as they tried to understand what they were seeing. Their language had words for prey, hiding, and fear, but lacked proper terms for hunting, stalking, or predation when applied to intelligent behavior. Vexkala asked how humans had survived on a world full of dangerous predators without developing armor or living in floating cities. Kate explained that humans had simply killed or driven away anything that threatened them. Most Earth predators now existed only in protected parks or zoos. The concept of humans as predators rather than prey required the Zephyrians to completely rethink their understanding of intelligence and civilization. They had always assumed that becoming sapient meant learning to hide from apex predators, not learning to become better at being apex predators. Joe's preparation for the ship-wide feast began in the main galley with careful butchering of the VOR Cathan meat. The creature's muscle structure was similar to large Earth herbivores, but with better marbling due to its carnivorous diet. The meat had a rich red color that promised excellent flavor. Amy observed the food preparation process from a scientific perspective while Joe worked with his culinary team. The VOR Cathan meat looked and smelled remarkably similar to venison or elk. Joe's initial taste tests confirmed that the flavor was excellent with a slight gamey quality that could be enhanced with proper seasoning. Rick Palma noted that the hunting expedition had been disappointingly easy and requested permission to organize recreational hunting trips for crew members who wanted the experience. He pointed out that the Zephyrians could use human hunting skills to finally clear the VOR Cathan from their homeworld. The ship's mess hall was decorated for a special occasion as Joe and his team prepared the feast. Word had spread through the crew that they would be eating meat from the creature that had terrorized an entire alien civilization for 3,000 years. The mood was festive and slightly surreal. Vexkala and several other Zephyrians were invited to join the feast as honored guests. The idea of eating a VOR Cathan was so alien to them that the translation computer had trouble finding appropriate words. It was like asking them to eat a hurricane or consume a volcanic eruption. Joe presented the main course as perfectly grilled VOR Cathan steaks with a selection of human spices and vegetables. The meat was tender and flavorful with a taste that most crew members compared to high-quality venison. Several people asked for second helpings. The Zephyrians watched in fascination and horror as the humans casually consumed their world's ultimate apex predator. Vexkala tentatively tried a small piece after much encouragement and admitted that it tasted quite good. His reaction was complicated by the fact that eating a VOR Cathan felt like a violation of natural law. Amy documented everything for her research records while enjoying her own meal. She noted that this was probably the first time in galactic history that first contact had resulted in one species accidentally solving another species' existential crisis by treating their apex predator as a dinner ingredient. Steve Cooper experimented with different cooking methods and created what he called apex predator tacos using shredded VOR Cathan meat with human seasonings. The dish was surprisingly popular with both humans and the few Zephyrians brave enough to try it. By the end of the feast, the cultural gap between humans and Zephyrians had begun to close in an unexpected way. The Zephyrians were starting to understand that their new human friends were not just allies but were actually much more dangerous than the VOR Cathan had ever been. Vexkala made a formal speech thanking the humans for showing his people that the world enders could be defeated. He admitted that Zephyrian civilization had become stagnant because they spent all their energy hiding instead of growing and exploring. The evening ended with Joe taking requests for tomorrow's menu. Several crew members asked if there were more VOR Cathan available for hunting and whether the meat could be prepared in different ways. The ship's new favorite food had once been an entire planet's greatest nightmare. Captain Morrison's log entry for the day noted that this had been humanity's most unusual first contact experience. They had solved a 3,000-year-old problem, made new allies, and discovered an excellent new source of protein all in the same afternoon. 3 months after first contact, the Zephyrian homeworld looked completely different from space. Lights sparkled in the forest valleys where no Zephyrian had dared to live for 3,000 years. The first ground-level settlements in recorded history were taking shape under the protection of human hunting teams. Captain Morrison established a permanent base camp in what had once been considered the most dangerous region of the planet. The camp grew quickly as more Zephyrians overcame their ancestral fears and joined the surface settlements. For the first time in millennia, Zephyrian children could play on solid ground. Vexkala earned a new title among his people, Groundwalker, created specifically for Zephyrians brave enough to live on the planet's surface. He spent most of his time learning human hunting techniques from Joe Martinez and had become surprisingly skilled at tracking VOR Cathan through the dense forests. Amy Foster's research station documented the ecological changes happening across the planet. With the VOR Cathan population under control for the first time in millions of years, dozens of smaller species emerged from hiding. The planet's biodiversity exploded as prey animals no longer needed to spend their entire lives hiding. The VOR Cathan themselves began changing their behavior as they encountered true predators for the first time in their evolutionary history. The survivors became more cautious and started avoiding areas where humans were active. Some even began hunting in smaller groups instead of the bold solo attacks they had used for centuries. Rick Palmer organized regular hunting expeditions that served multiple purposes. The hunts kept the VOR Cathan population manageable while providing fresh meat for both human and Zephyrian settlements. They also gave crew members recreational activities and helped train Zephyrian volunteers in combat techniques. Joe Martinez had become something of a celebrity among both species for his culinary innovations with VOR Cathan meat. His recipe collection now included everything from simple grilled steaks to complex stews and his famous apex predator tacos. Even the Zephyrians had developed a taste for properly prepared world-ender meat. Kate Sullivan worked with Zephyrian engineers to modify their floating cities with landing platforms and ground-level access. The engineering challenges were fascinating as they adapted technology designed for hiding and escaping to serve expansion and exploration instead. Dan Rogers helped establish communication networks between the surface settlements and the traditional Zephyrian cities. Many older Zephyrians were still too afraid to come down to ground level, but they supported the surface communities with supplies and technical assistance from their floating homes. Linda Hayes and Steve Cooper trained the first Zephyrian security forces in modern combat techniques. The aliens learned quickly, and their four-armed anatomy actually gave them advantages with certain types of weapons. Within months, mixed human Zephyrian patrol teams were protecting the new settlements. Ben Clark mapped the safest flight corridors between Zephyrian cities and human settlements while documenting the changing distribution of VOR Cathan populations. His surveys showed that the creatures were already adapting to human presence by moving to more remote areas of the planet. The cultural exchange benefited both species in unexpected ways. Zephyrian defensive technology combined with human offensive capabilities created exploration and defense systems that neither species could have developed alone. The partnership was proving more valuable than anyone had initially expected. Vexkala made his first successful solo hunt of a young VOR Cathan after 2 months of training with human instructors. The achievement was celebrated throughout Zephyrian society as proof that their species could finally fight back against their ancient enemies. Songs were written about the groundwalker who learned to hunt. World Enders Amy's research revealed that the VOR Cathan had actually been suppressing the evolution of every other species on the planet for millions of years. With the apex predators under control, rapid evolutionary changes began appearing in prey species as they adapted to life without constant fear. The joint settlements developed their own unique culture, blending human practicality with Zephyrian artistry. Buildings combined human defensive design with Zephyrian aesthetic sensibilities. Gardens mixed earth crops with native plants. Children of both species played together in parks that would have been death traps just months earlier. Joe's Kitchen became a center of cultural exchange as Zephyrian cooks learned human techniques while teaching their own methods for preparing native plants and smaller animals. The fusion cuisine that developed was popular with both species and helped break down remaining cultural barriers. Steve Cooper's experimental cooking with VOR Cathan meat had evolved into a minor art form. His latest creation, Predator Pot Roast, was requested for special occasions by both humans and Zephyrians. The irony of turning apex predators into comfort food was not lost on anyone. The Horizon prepared to depart after 6 months but left behind a thriving joint colony that was already planning its own expansion across the planet. Captain Morrison's final report noted that this had been humanity's most successful first contact mission, both diplomatically and gastronomically. Rick Palmer submitted recommendations for establishing permanent human-Zephyrian security partnerships. On other worlds, the combination of human combat skills and Zephyrian technology could be valuable for protecting colonies throughout this region of space. Vexkala's farewell speech was broadcast to Zephyrian cities across the planet. He thanked the humans for teaching his people that even the most terrifying challenges could be overcome with courage and proper preparation. He also requested detailed recipes for Joe's seasoning blends. The last transmission from the surface came from the groundwalker himself, asking if humans could send more hunting instructors and detailed instructions for preparing what Joe had called Apex Predator barbecue sauce. The request was accompanied by orders for more human-style cooking equipment. Amy's final research summary concluded that the Zephyrian homeworld was experiencing the most rapid positive ecological change in its recorded history. The removal of apex predator pressure had unleashed evolutionary forces that had been suppressed for geological ages. As the horizon jumped to hyperspace, Captain Morrison reflected on the mission's outcomes. They had made valuable allies, established a successful colony, and discovered an excellent new source of protein. Most importantly, they had freed an entire civilization from 3,000 years of terror. The greatest irony was that the solution had been so simple that it almost seemed unfair. One species' ultimate nightmare had become another species. Weekend barbecue. Sometimes the universe had a sense of humor about these things. In the end, the VOR Cathan learned what every apex predator eventually discovers. There is always something higher up the food chain. They just had not expected it to come from space with plasma rifles and seasoning recipes.